And hi, everyone. My name is Alena Cierna. I am a senior program officer at UNEP-WCMC within the nature economy team. And my work is focusing on supporting different initiatives for corporate or private sector accountability. I work on supporting different frameworks and standards for corporate disclosure. And this book is not directly related to that, but it mentions a lot of the initiatives that I also had a chance to collaborate with. So that was particularly satisfying to see them in writing and to see they're already making waves. With Sid, who's a friend of mine, but also a very interesting person, and asked him to tell us about the book that he has written. Siddarth Shrikanth is an investment director with Just Climate's Natural Climate Solution Strategy, and he's also a visiting researcher at Oxford University. He studied biological sciences at Oxford and worked in corporate sustainability for McKinsey in London and in Indonesia before moving to Hong Kong to be a foreign correspondent for the Financial Times.
Alena, do you mind speaking up a little bit?
Okay.
Thank you.
Should I repeat from the start?
No.
Okay.
A little louder.
Just a bit louder. Okay. So Sid gained a joint MPA and MBA from the Harvard Kennedy School and Stanford Graduate School of Business, during which he co-founded a natural carbon removal startup. And he also consulted for the World Bank, the Singapore government, on environment. What is better? Yes. Thank you. And in 2023, they published his book, The Case for Nature, Pioneering Solutions for the Outer Planetary Crisis. Welcome, Sid. So wonderful background that you have. You know, in the bio, we can see all the different experiences that you've had a chance to kind of collect throughout your career so far. Maybe tell us a little bit more about what is your role at the moment? What does an investment director actually do?
Okay. Now?
Yes.
Amazing. First of all, so thank you for having me. It's such a dream to speak here. I've come once before, but it's amazing to be back in this context. Thank you, Alena. Thank you, Diane. Thank you everyone for being here. What does an investment director do? There are many ways to answer that question. I think the way I think about it is investing is actually very similar to everything else I've done in one important sense. I think you follow your curiosity to the point where it becomes hopefully useful to someone else. And that's the same as journalism. It's the same as research, which many of you engage in. And hopefully it's the same with anyone. It's the same sort of thing that anyone who works in the space does every single day. It's just the context is slightly different. So with research, you might want to, I was just reading about a new organelle in cells called the nitroblast that they discovered last year. You might find things like that, which are really breakthrough scientific discoveries or new ways of doing business or policy. And with investing, what you try and do is find entrepreneurs with businesses that you can then support as they scale. And we have a colleague metrics. We actually announced a deal in that company yesterday. Good example of that, right? A company that's going to come out of the research world, is commercializing, and we have the chance to support them with capital, but actually, frankly, capital is the least important bit. It's everything else that comes with helping companies grow and have the impact they hope to have. I will admit, I know very little about investing as a whole, because I've only really done it in one context, which is climate and nature. And so most of my job actually involves going quite deep into the science, understanding what works and what doesn't work, and what could work if things happen. It does involve understanding policy and markets and how those things are changing. Often involves lots of travel to places to understand how things happen on the ground, because it's very hard to do this work sitting at a desk and hoping that things go right. It's also really hard to parachute in and tell people what to do. So in a sense, I quite like this format because you're not saying I know how to do it better than you. You're saying who are the best entrepreneurs or business builders in these places, and how can we support them to do the work that they've set out to do? And so that's what I love about it, but it's in some ways it's very similar to any other form of research. And so that's what I do.
Know that this is a potential career path when you were a student.
I didn't know this was a career path. And frankly, I don't even know what a career path is, to be honest. Because the CV is slightly embarrassing because it's a long list of random twists and turns I've taken along the way that seem to make no sense together. But at each stage, what I ended up doing was just picking the next thing that seemed really interesting. And so when I started off as a biologist, I did it because I love biology, I love ecology and climate science and evolutionary biology and conservation and all these things that I'm sure you study. I almost did a PhD and was strongly advised not to by people much smarter than me. And so I got cold feet. And at that point I said, okay, what do I do? And I ended up at McKinsey because that was frankly the only job I had at the time, but also a chance to learn how the business world works. I knew nothing about that. Frankly, I still know very little, but you learn along the way. And I think it was an amazing 2 years of training. And when I knew I wasn't going to be there long term, had a great kind of education in how business works, but I wanted to go work on the ground and ended up finding my way to Indonesia, set up a new nonprofit focused on plastic pollution, both the ecological and social bits. So kind of you follow that path, journalism, more research, startups, investing. I think it doesn't make any sense partly because it's been driven by curiosity, not by a grand vision. Don't have to business in that.
So it's the curiosity that kind of drives you when you go to the next opportunity. Is there anything specific that you look for when you or that you were looking for when you were thinking about next steps at each stage?
Yeah, I think the last time I was seriously considering kind of what to do next was when I was finishing up my master's degrees in the US. And there are lots of different paths you can take. I think the one I ended up picking was one where you by definition and through the job, you end up looking at lots of different problems almost every single day, certainly week to week and month to month. And for me, it was a good fit because I like learning that way. For others, actually, it's a much better fit to pick one problem and go really deep and try and get to the bottom of it. I love the kind of breadth of what I do today, but it does mean I rely on the people who do the depth because otherwise we wouldn't. So it's really matching skill sets and what you enjoy with what you're curious about and learn. So that's how I end up picking this.
And you also got to work and live in different countries and so on. And you're originally from India.
And you grew up in India?
Yeah. You have a family that is already passionate about nature. And I like how you weave that into the book and kind of the stories that you tell there. How did that influence you?
Well, I mean, families influence you hugely, right? And I think I was very lucky to have that kind of background. Something that I deeply cared about the natural world. I'm actually curious, in this room, how many of your families were at least interested in nature in some form as you're growing up? Quite a lot, probably, right? It's probably the majority. It's a hugely influential part of your life. And so I think it's no surprise, and it does kind of carry through generations. But the thing I got was not just a deep love for the natural world. And I've never needed a reason to do this, right? It's in some ways, all the stuff around policy and finance is a way to fit that very intrinsic motivation with the real world and the limitations of that, and the fact that not everyone shares that. And so I've had to learn the language of finance, the language of academia or policy. But I'm sure a lot of you will agree that you really need no reason to do this beyond the fact that nature is amazing and we are nature in many ways. So it's balancing. It can be a grounding force, especially when very pragmatic. It takes longer than you expect to materialize.
Yeah. How do you describe this book to people?
Oh my gosh, you can read it. How do I describe this book to people? Depends on the it's in some way it's a piece of narrative nonfiction, that's what it is. So it's research-based, but it's not intended to be a research book. It draws on the research people like Alena, people like yourselves. It draws on the work of communities and businesses and policymakers across the world who've been doing really interesting things to help protect and restore nature. what I ended up doing was, and the journalism training was extremely helpful because what I learned in biology was how nature works. What I didn't learn was how to communicate that very well. And I think journalism taught me a huge amount about how you can take incredibly complicated things and make them accessible, not simple, but accessible to people who might not share the same, foundational understanding of what you're talking about. So that's what I tried to do. I mean, it was an exploration of some of the biggest topics I think are important for the way we manage our companies and our societies and how they interact with nature, whether it's our food system, the feed and conservation and restoration across the world, new tools of finance and policy, new technologies and how they might help. But I tried to almost explain it to myself for the first time from first principles. And so it reads a bit like a travel book. Because it is set in lots of really interesting places. It's not intended to be a textbook. I'm not qualified to write it. But it was fun to read and fun to write. Hopefully fun to read. I read it over a year. I have no idea what's in it anymore. No, but hopefully it's fun to read because I think
It was, yeah, because you add those personal stories. So in each chapter, he describes like one of the solutions that he has come across, but then also tells the story of how he maybe visited the project or the site where it's being tested, or maybe spoke to someone like from a company that is trying to make it happen. I think that just also shows the human side of all of these ideas. They might not be perfect, but there are teams or people behind them that are trying to make them better every day. It gave me a lot of hope.
And the other thing I learned was even when you don't agree with the outcomes or the conclusions or carbon credits, for example, really controversial topic. Lots of credits that are absolutely worthless out there. What I was struck by was, look, there are absolutely bad actors in the world. But by and large, most of what happens from people who intend to do the right thing and lack the tools or the knowledge or the resources to do it in a way that we might not take it. And this is particularly true, I think, of the people on the ground, right? The people who actually live in these landscapes, steward those landscapes, and the small business owners, frankly, because let's be real, these are really small businesses, even the ones that seem like a big deal in the conservation world, in the grand scheme of things. I looked up this guy yesterday. If you add up all the agribusiness companies in the world, so businesses that are deeply tied to the agricultural value chain, it's $14 trillion in enterprise value. That's a big market. Right? All of the new solutions are at a much earlier stage. They are growing, and one of the themes in the book is they're really coming up. And since the last year and a half, actually, we've seen even more evolution there, like nature metrics. But I think the big gap I see is from there to the massive sectors that need transforming. And so it's good to keep that perspective in mind as well.
Yeah, really making it mainstream. Yeah. You kind of developed this book after being awarded a prize. It's called the Brackenbauer Prize. It's an award given to the best business book proposal of the year by a young writer. And it's awarded by the Financial Times and McKinsey. Tell us about the process of writing it. How did you get the idea? Yeah, how long did it take you to write it?
Yeah, I think it's now they rebranded. I think it's just called the Bracken Prize, and I think it's just run by the FD.
Okay.
I don't know the latest, but I'd highly recommend anyone who's thinking about something like this to look at it. Because I had no idea how to write a proposal, right? And what was really good about that is, so many of you share this. If I don't have a deadline, I won't do it. And there was a deadline, and there was a clear format they had. It was, I think, 5,000 words or something like that. And you lay out why you think this book needs to exist, what it's about, who's going to read it, and what you need to actually go off and write it. So it's not particularly hard. And I did it because I've been thinking about this topic for a while and trying to understand how I could spend my energy on it. And part of it's through a career, but I do love to write. And so one of the other pieces was, how can I write something that's useful to people? And the proposal prize was a really good one. I didn't win the prize, by the way. I came.
Oh, sorry.
I didn't win it. I was in the top 3, and no one told me what happened. But that ultimately it didn't matter, right? Because one of the judges for the prize ended up being was an agent, and so she, I think, took pity on me and said, I can work with it. This was pretty good, but it could be a lot better. Let's work on it. And so we spent about 6 months working on the proposal. It's a proposal that actually gets picked up by places like Penguin and Duckworth. It takes a lot of work. It's work that frankly I had no idea how to do, but so you need help with that. And that's how it happened. I do love to write, and so it helps that I had a writing track record because that's the other piece. When publishers look at books, they want to see an interesting idea. They want to see that you can access the right people to actually go out and write this thing. But they also want to make sure that you will actually write the thing and it will be reasonably good. Because the biggest fear is you sign something up and it never comes up, right? Or it takes 2 or 3 or 4 years. And so that was helpful.
Oh, it's a really nice opportunity, and I haven't heard about this prize either. So, yeah, if there's someone in the room that has an idea.
Yeah, there's another prize as well. There's a prize called the 9 Dots Prize. It's actually due in a few weeks, maybe 2 weeks. It's an essay prize, so you don't even have to write a book proposal. And they give you, the winner gets a cash prize of, I can't remember how much, and a book contract. And this year's topic is something like, what happens to data in this new world, or something like that. It's interesting because I think there is a climate and nature angle to that. That could be quite interesting to people in the room. Yeah.
So what draws our attention, obviously, is the title, The Case for Nature. In this room, we all know that there is a case for nature.
Yeah.
What do readers from a more kind of private sector or finance world, what do they find compelling? What is the case that makes sense to them?
So, the title belies a certain, I think, complexity because it's not one case, right? There's multiple different cases you can make for protecting and restoring nature. It all adds up to quite a powerful case, I think. But depending on who you speak to, different things matter, right? And so for a lot of people, intrinsic motivations are enough. I suspect many of the people in this room would agree. But as you move into different worlds, I think what you have to understand is if you're a policymaker, you're balancing lots of different things. And there are trade-offs. And time is short and money is short. And so what we have to try and help them with is how, for example, restoring nature in cities can actually help advance the goals that they also care about, which are things like public health, extreme heat, this livability of these cities. And so what we've seen is one of the cases in the book is actually about that. And so that case is an economic case, right? You're saying you save money on public health spending, you save money on mental health spending that comes associated with the lack of access to green space. You clean up the air, and people want to live in your city, and that's a good thing. And in the process, you actually create thriving ecosystems, and that's a powerful case. It's a different one from, if you were speaking to someone in finance, for example. And finance isn't one thing. There are lots of different types of investors. That's the other big thing to flag. There are lots of different types of financial institutions. They all care about very different things, but you can make different cases there. If you're working with local communities in places where agricultural markets or these new environmental markets don't exist, then you might make a case that's based on something that doesn't sound very likely. And using the tourism that does exist in that region, which is often the only source of income, but using it for protecting and restoring nature along the way and tying those two outcomes together. None of these are perfect. And in isolation, none of them can really solve the problem. But you can end up combining multiple of these. So we were just talking about the food system. That's a really good example of there are lots of different stakeholders that do care about different things. So if you're a large company, you're sourcing from a complex supply chain, you care that you can continue to source coffee or cocoa or whatever it might be. You really care. And the fact that that's failing in lots of places makes for quite a powerful story if you can say, here's what you have to do to change that. What I've realized is a lot of that spend doesn't get classified as sustainability spend or nature spend or climate spend. It's often just business as usual spend because if you can't buy the thing you need, you buy it from somewhere else or you invest to make sure someone can produce it for you. This is happening all over the world. I think we're going to see more of that in the current political environment of companies and large institutions of all sorts doing the things they have to do to stay in business. And if we can give them alternatives that are good for nature, then that's a really good thing. The same is true of governments with things like flood mitigation. Flooding is increasing everywhere. England's a great example of that, where natural flood defenses have been systematically destroyed for hundreds of years. You could build lots of grey infrastructure to try and stop that, but it's much cheaper and far better for people and nature to try and bring back natural ecosystems, right? So making those choices available And in some cases, creating businesses that can actually deliver those services on the ground, like contractors build buildings, could be really good things. So I think it's all about finding what people value and tying that back into the ways in which nature can provide that value.
And it's also about resourcing, right? We often hear that there's not enough resources or more sustainability action and so on, but these are risk reduction measures, right? That the company would be doing anyways. They just.
And the other thing to flag is there is there's I think a well-founded fear of commodification of nature and turning nature into nothing more than a financial asset. The truth is, the current economy already commodifies nature. Right? Like, it's any standing forest in the world today has a price. It's the price of the timber in the forest, and lots of people are going to pay their price. The same is true of agriculture. We currently commodify agriculture, and we do produce food to feed more than enough food to feed the world. We don't distribute it very well, but we already do this. And so I think that ship has sailed arguably for hundreds of years since the dawn of industrial capitalism. But what we now have is a way to actually value other things. And so that's kind of where the book comes from. It's not from a place of, because philosophically you could build a different economy from scratch. I would love to do that. And if anyone has any ideas for how to do that soon, I would love to work on it. But I think, and this isn't so much let's change the system from within or from outside. I think wherever you are on that spectrum, the system exists. It's currently destroying nature. It's currently destroying people's lives. And there are bright spots and cases that are very different. And I think we have to find ways to make that accessible to more people so they can then do those things instead of the business as usual options that we have. So it's really about finding those areas where valuing nature in some form and actually give people the other things they value.
Yeah. In my work, I have an opportunity to, sometimes interact with different financial institutions, but they tend to be the larger banks, the larger kind of, or maybe central banks. You work in a space of kind of venture investing that has a bit of a culture of its own, right? The venture investors that invest in startups and so on have a specific outlook on the world. What do they think about nature, sustainability, all of this? Is it even more of an opportunity to them, or is it basically just looking for the bottom line?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think I would put all private markets investing in the same bucket. It's not just venture, there's kind of later stage investing, growth investing, and beyond. So basically investing in things that are not large public. Right? It's all private markets. And within that context, people look for different things. I think by and large, most in asset managers, so the people actually deploying the money, look for attractive risk-adjusted financial return. Why do they look for that? Because they have to raise money from people who look for that. Who are those people? By and large, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and university endowments. Those are the biggest sources of capital. There are large pools of retail money, which is basically individual, directed. You might choose where to invest your own money. By and large, that's actually a smaller portion of the institutional capital market. It's worth remembering though that pension fund money is meant to be for our benefit, and sovereign wealth fund money is meant to be for our benefit, and so on. But the way it's currently deployed, they have a legal obligation to maximize financial return for their beneficiaries. And some of the largest pension funds in the world are public employee retirement systems in the US, in Canada, even in the UK. And so there's a good reason for that, right? It's an aging population. They want to make sure they're secure in retirement, and they've given up a big share of their earnings, and they hope that when they retire, they'll get it back, some of it. So that's the macro context, but that drives everything, right? For good reason, I think. That's where you end up with investment mandates, if you will. So you when you raise money, you tell people what you're going to invest in, how it might make money, why you might be good at it, and then hopefully they give you some money. You go off and deploy it. In private markets, you wait a long time before the money comes back. So inherently, it's risky. If you invest in something and you don't like it anymore, you can't sell it, right? You can only sell it when that company is either bought by another company or goes public, or there's a sale of those shares in some specific case, but that inherently raises the risk of these assets versus investing in large public. The reason I say all that is just to say, within this ecosystem, this portion of the capital markets, there is a big opportunity, right, to actually invest in solutions. Because you don't just have to invest in companies and help them transition. That's what the big banks are focused on in some ways. Where the very large companies have huge nature risk, for example, they start managing it. With earlier stage companies of all sorts, you can actually pick the ones that you think are going to be in demand in the future. And my belief, what we do at Just Climate, is founded on the belief that the climate transition will happen. And that we do need to find the solutions that can help accelerate that. And as we're seeing already, many of those solutions in the nature space both help you either avoid carbon emissions or remove carbon emissions, and help you create more resilient food systems or more resilient ecosystems in general. So we're already seeing the effects of climate change, and many of these solutions actually help slow the pace of those effects, or at least the impacts on societies, right? Whether it's flooding or drought or wildfire. And so I think if you believe those things, if you believe climate change is real and that it's accelerating, you believe that actually the inevitable policy response to that is what it is. And in the meantime, there's a huge amount of human suffering and economic pain that comes along with it, then you will believe these solutions are in demand. And so then you can go find the solutions you think will be part of that future economy and try and help them scale. But it's all hard and risky, which is why not many people do it. And frankly, there are much easier spaces to invest in. If you invest in business software, for example, it's much more straightforward, much easier to make returns and get an exit and all the things people care about. But what we try to do is we're thematic and we're very focused. We only do this. Hopefully that means we can build teams that really care about this. We can spend lots of time on research and curiosity and speaking to the people who actually do these things and take a view on what might work, and then spend a lot of time with the companies actually helping them grow up. So there are different ways of doing it. No one way is better than the other, but my conviction is this is necessary, and there's the things that we need to align can align with this bit.
Just Climate has it in your investment vision sort of mandate. So you think that if we're trying to change the way other investors are looking at this, the tipping point is influencing what these funders of funders are doing, so
Exactly. But that's exactly what we try and, our mission statement, I'm not going to quote the mission statement, but essentially what we're about is making climate-led investing an asset allocation imperative. There's a lot of buzzwords in this, let me break it down. Climate-led investing for us is starting with science. I say climate-led, but actually we put climate and nature in the same bucket. We treat it, the way we kind of manage the living systems and the physical systems that surround us. Start with the science, right? And that leads you to certain sectors that are off track. Absolutely, the land sector is off track. The industrial sectors are mostly off track. And we believe that, when you invest in that way, you can deliver attractive financial returns and the impact that you care about. But the second part of the mission statement is actually really, really important, right? Because that's the piece that says we want this to become an asset allocation imperative, which means we want more of the pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and university endowments to start thinking this way. Many already are, and many have backed us. But there's a long way to go because we're tiny in the grand scheme of things. We're 50 people on our team. We just opened an office in Brazil. So we have San Francisco, Brazil, London. We're really small. And at the end of the day, we will not grow up to become the whole financial system. There's no way. We're part of the Generation Group, which was founded 20 years ago with the same mission, but for broader sustainability. Overall, if you add all of us up, it's about 200 people. That's really small. And the only hope is that we can actually change the way the people with the real money make decisions. And there's a long way to go. But the only way you do that is by starting to prove the case for it. So we do need more. We need many, many, many more investors thinking this way.
As you do with the book. I wanted to ask you which of the solutions was your favorite to write about? Kind of in the different chapters, I think there are blue carbon projects, there's ecotourism, there is a rewilding farm here in the UK, and green infrastructure, LiDAR that is used by Conservancy in Kenya and so on. Yeah, which of these examples was your favorite?
I'm not allowed to pick favorites. No, they're all amazing, obviously. I think the ones I chose, it was really hard to pick the ones I put in the book because there were so many others that could have written about. And you have to balance breadth and depth, right? You can't start with 10 case studies. Each of the chapters opens in a single place with a single initiative and then broadens out and talks about others. And it just had to be selective and tell the most evocative human stories alongside the technical financial stories. But each of the cases in the book, and you mentioned pretty much all of them, have one thing in common, which is actually the thing I loved most about it, and that was my favorite, was meeting the people behind it, right? Because each of those cases involves someone somewhere who said, I'm going to do something differently. And some of these are small, some of these are big, but fundamentally they're all united by the same kind of ultimate mission, which is value the standard nature around them or help restore ecosystems in a way that makes their communities, safer, healthier, more prosperous. And that's easier said than done. So these are real case studies of people doing this imperfectly, but doing their best. I think all of those people I would call my friends at this point. And that's been the best part of it.
We talked a little bit about carbon credits already. It's one of the buzzwords, right, in the space. I had the opportunity to go to the CBD COP in Cali, and the crowd that all of the kind of biodiversity credits and carbon credits events were drawing was huge. Some people came to Cali just to talk about those. What do you think are some other buzzwords in this space, kind of from your perspective at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, the thing I will say is I don't think biodiversity credits are a buzzword because people don't always appreciate that. I'm not talking about the new voluntary credits where a company might buy them in the goodness of their hearts. Regulated biodiversity markets are huge. They're much bigger than carbon markets. They're about $12 billion a year, according to the UN, according to your report, the State of Finance for Nature report. And they're built on policies like biodiversity net gain in the UK, but wetland mitigation banking in the US, lots of markets like this in Europe and Australia and South Africa and lots of other things that involve, I mean, they come from a very, very basic insight, which is when you develop in any form, infrastructure or housing or whatever it might be, and you're converting an ecosystem, we will make you, at the very least, try and put something back in place. Is it imperfect? Yes, right? But we've had huge learnings in those markets over the last, they're really old markets. I mean, wetland mitigation came out of the Endangered Species Act in the 80s in the US, right? And it's still operating, still scaling. I spoke to a developer in one of these markets just this week, and they're entirely policy driven, right? So governments have just said, you can't just convert any habitat you want. At the very least, we're going to make you pay. And so the reason I say that is, you can dress up old things in new clothes, but that's actually a really big market that we've learned a lot. It's not perfect, but we have to use that as a starting point. And frankly, I would say that's a much better starting point for biodiversity credits than new voluntary biodiversity credits. And I've seen this a lot in the space, right? Where you have things that have been going on for a long time and they kind of lose momentum in the public consciousness and come back in a new form, but the thing never went away, right? And I mean, there's a couple of other examples in the book of that, but and I'm not saying these are bad initiatives. I actually think it's worthwhile. But the good thing from the voluntary biodiversity credit movement in the last 2 or 3 years has been we've spent a lot more time thinking more rigorously about what metrics to use and how those individual metrics aggregate into units or not, or don't aggregate into units in many cases, right? The pitfalls of that approach and how you might do it well. There's been a lot of learning there. A lot of smart people have spent some time. That's very important. But the other one was, I think there's in the book, there was an idea a couple of years ago, which, I mean, it still could happen around new natural asset companies, things that are explicitly built to value nature. And in a sense, it's a really good idea to have that embedded in the functioning of a company. But you said this to me before, I'm going to credit you for this.
Okay.
I know, all companies should be doing that. And lots of companies, I would say the $14 trillion of agribusiness value, those are natural asset companies. They're just natural asset companies that are attractive. And there may be other models that do the same thing. So I just think we should think very carefully about all of the learnings that sit within huge industries and massive policies, as well as trying to find new solutions.
I think some people might challenge on the biodiversity credits point as well.
Yeah, no, and by the way, my point isn't that we don't need biodiversity credits. My point is, I'm a big believer in whatever it takes to save nature. So if someone is going to buy biodiversity credits, sell them biodiversity credits and use it to conserve nature. Like, I would love that. I want more of that. I've been disappointed, and I think many people in the room who care about nature and want biodiversity credits share my disappointment that the demand is not material. And that's why I'd love to.
I have boatloads of questions, I'm sure other people do, just was,
I
wasn't sure if I could raise my hand or not.
About this, but my point is just if as long as we can, there are large financial flows in the world, and there are potential new financial flows, right? And any new source of finance, we should take it. Let's do it. But there are also very large existing finance flows. So the 12 billion a year in compliance markets, like we might as well use that better because there's 12 billion a year there, right? If the number's right. And I'm not sure, there's some assumptions in there. I'm looking to you. But that's just my only point is it's absolutely worth using and reshaping the massive flows, including subsidies, as well as looking for new sources of finance. That's my only point. I think innovation is good.
Yeah, we can have a little bit of a discussion about that. Let's go into the Q&A. I want to make sure that we have time to do that, but maybe just to wrap up this part. In the last chapter or in the conclusion, you are staying away from kind of broad recommendations and saying, oh, we just need policy change and so on, because I agree that has been said by other people in, very deep studies. And I like that you put forward instead sort of a set of guiding principles that you try to follow, and they're there in case someone else as an individual wants to try to follow them. But that's your suggestion. What are the most important kind of guiding principles that you try to have, or would suggest we consider as a society? Or
the main one, and it's actually not directed at anyone in this room, it's directed at the people because my main one is the biggest resource that most of us have, apart from the extremely wealthy, is our time. And I don't just mean our free time, I mean the energy we give to our jobs, to our livelihoods, to most of our time is spent doing what we do for work. And I think the biggest change, and this is what I mean, everyone here clearly does it. So it's actually getting more people to consider careers directly in whatever form. I mean, it could be in accounting, it could be in, obviously it could be in science and policy and this kind of thing, but I think almost any skill can be used in service of some of the goals that we share. And so that was my main kind of guiding principle. And I would just encourage everyone here, given you already do this, to try and encourage other people who might not be considering careers in this space to do that. There's also other things you can do if that's not feasible, but in this room, I would say that's the biggest one that I'd love others to be inspired by, because there's so much amazing talent and experience in the room.
well, if you ever want to join us and
sign up.
be on our side of things, then thank you. Let's have a little time for some questions. First one here in the front, and then second.
And can you say your name and
Sure. Hi, I'm Rachel Garrett. I'm a professor of conservation and development. So when you were just connecting a bunch of things you said, because at first, one of the things you said was you noticed that a bunch of things didn't work out or weren't going to work out, mostly because of very localized factors like a lack of knowledge or whatever. And then I was like, what about all the systemic problems and lock-ins? But then later you were talking about how policy was like almost the single most important thing. So I guess my question is, to what extent do you experience what I would expect, a lot of projects that can't succeed because of the policy climate and the market climate's just never going to allow them to succeed? And then two, like, if that is the case, how do you not get really frustrated, or like, how do you, what do you feel the role of what you can actually do to tip the scales on this? And three, relatedly, do you in your organization ever get involved in activities that would help build political will and advocate for policy change?
So it's a great question, hard one. I don't have all the answers, but the way I think there are things we can do to change the rules. Because like markets are not we created markets. We can reshape them, we can change the rules, and we have in many cases. We've said things that are simply bad for profit, but are just the right thing to do. Right? We no longer, for example, the whole wave of action on modern slavery of the last 20 years is something that we've just chosen as a society to do. Modern slavery would be good for business, right? It would make our goods cheaper. And we've said we don't want that. And we just made it happen. I mean, there's still issues with it, but by and large, that's been a serious success story. And we can do that with a lot of the things we're talking about. We can say anything linked to deforestation is out. It no longer plays by the rules. So I think policy change is really important. Within a kind of within the constraints that we've just described of asset allocation and policy and markets, I think there are lots, and this is partly linked to the biodiversity credit point. I think there are lots of things we can do. It does not solve the whole problem, right? It doesn't solve the problem in places where broadly markets don't reach. It also doesn't solve the kind of deeper systemic problems. But what it does help solve is the problems that are linked to very large pools of value in the economy today. So I keep coming back to agriculture. If there is that much money in agriculture, which there definitely is, and it's a risk from climate change and biodiversity loss, and the solutions that can help spread that needle for companies should be valuable. And they are, they are beginning to grow. And that's exactly what we try and invest in at Just Climate. And lots of other investors are looking at it as well. They cannot solve the whole problem, right? But I think we can actually because those companies are overlooked, right? They're not like these are the companies that people are looking at and saying they're going to be unicorns and beyond. They're overlooked, they're undercapitalized, they're good people trying to do hard things within a system that's broken, and we can help them. So that's what I would do within the system. And the same is true of policy. Like there are policies that exist that we simply don't use very well. I would say all the compliant biodiversity markets are, well, I wouldn't say we don't use very well, but there's definitely room for improvement, more energy and innovation there. The same is true of and any kind of market that involves nature in some way. And so that's what I would focus on, but the changing of the rules is ultimately essential. Yeah. But that's why I don't lose hope, because there's some stuff we can do.
We had a question here.
There's actually three questions from online now, but I can ask the first one.
Yeah.
Which is, Sid, thanks for the great talk. I want to reflect on the role of the private sector in funding nature conservation and recovery. I'm Tom and doing a PhD under Rachel Garrett. Okay, so Tom Bunting, it's on funding conservation and restoration in the Brazilian Cerrado.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the things you've mentioned, like flood protection and climate regulation, are public goods that should be provided by governments. Without government policy, it doesn't seem like the private sector will invest in nature. Can you share cases where the private sector does invest in nature without government intervention? Bonus points if you can give examples in agriculture.
Yes. Can you ask me if I get the bonus points at the end? No, there's an important insight in there, which is it's hard for private companies to provide public goods unless, and this is the exception, the private component of those public goods is valuable enough. So to give you an example, in the book, I talk about Blue Forest Conservation, which is an NGO based in the US. They help structure forest thinning and forest management deals outside of enabling policy. They do take government subsidies, but there's no policy environment for this to incentivize it. Because what they noticed was wildfires are really bad for global climate change, really bad for public health, but they're also really bad for some very specific people who have a lot of economic pain associated with it, whether it's insurers or the water companies in the region who have to then clear the debris out of reservoirs. That alone is so costly that they were willing to pay for it. So I'm not going to go into the details of the deal, but it's an example of public good, which is, and they've had a lot of success in the beginning of scale across the west of the US. The public good of lower wildfires being provided by a small number of private companies where the private gain alone is worth paying for the entire, because the cost benefit is way out of whack there, right? Like it doesn't cost very much to do it up front, and the benefits are huge, and so it works in that case. I think the agriculture case is very similar, but you've actually seen when you have, and this can veer to conclusions, so we have to be very careful about this, but you have seen one in Brazil, one in Indonesia, industry-led moratoriums on deforestation. In Brazil, there's a soy moratorium, which has had incredible success. Not perfect, but it's a threat. It's actually threatened right now by the current political environment, but soy moratorium in Cerrado has actually had a lot of impact, soy moratorium in the Amazon as well. And in Indonesia and Southeast Asia, you've had similar initiatives around palm oil and no deforestation commitments. Why do they do that? Because of the threat of future policy. So even in the absence of current policy, you can actually get industry actions if you can convince them credibly that future policy is coming. And in some cases it has come, in some cases it hasn't. So it's important to use that carefully, but it's possible to get, particularly because companies always say, if I do it and they don't do it, then I'm suffering. But if it's an industry-wide moratorium, you actually end up with no competitive disadvantage. And so you need to create special situations like that. Not easy, but it's possible.
And you can tell Thomas that if he would like references for some of those examples, Sid has kindly decided to leave us these 2 copies for the library, so they will be in the DAB library. Sorry, behind you, Dan, there was a question before, so I don't want to jump the queue. So let's go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Sally Ashby, and technical specialist in climate and conservation finance. Yeah, it's great to hear, and I look forward to reading the book. I guess my question was a bit around, you talked about a broken system. It's like, how do you deal with the things? Do you think there's a place for looking at risk sharing and how that is approached, and expectations with investors, and also those returns? It's like, it just feels like you're sort of fighting a losing battle. If you can make money, if money can be made in a much less risky, easier way, like, and you get better returns, are we really ever going to be able to compete? So I know policy has a place in that, but are there ways in which you found in your work that there's a way of overcoming that a bit more so it's competitive?
So it is the ultimate question, right? Can nature or natural assets we're talking about, can they compete with other asset classes? I don't think this is an asset class. I think there was a different asset classes that all touch nature. But in any case, I think it's a really good question. In some cases, maybe not. And we have to be honest about that. Which is why I think, at least when we look at our work at Just Climate, we're incredibly clear-eyed and humble about what we can do with the mandate we've been given and what we cannot do. And I think there's a risk of hubris in the investing community where you feel like you can do anything, and then you realize you can't do it or you don't want to do it. I think we just have to be honest about the places where private finance can be a good fit. I think a lot of it lies within existing economic systems and transitioning them, whether it's agriculture or in some cases restoration. I think for things like conservation, which are public goods, and typically you don't really want the market economy operating there to a large extent. You might, but in specific contexts. It may be a better thing to actually rely on folks like fauna and flora and governments, maybe in partnership. And then the question for that is, how do you get the money to do that at scale? I think it's the same way you raise money for all public goods, right? You tax, you spend, and in some ways we've forgotten that that is how we deliver all public goods. So it should be possible to do that if we agree that this is important. But there's this third question in there, which is, can you raise the return or lower the risk in a way that, I think there are lots of cases that are on the edge, where with some work, you can move things into the investable bucket. Not easy, but we have seen that happen. So, I mean, I can give you the example of the UK, whatever you say about the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Carbon Code and so on. The good thing about the way it's set up is when someone engages in that kind of restoration in the UK, you're not allowed to cut down the forest after that. Right? There's a legal liability on that land, essentially in perpetuity, or from the perspective of an individual in perpetuity. And so even if you disagree with the methodology and the additionality calculations and all the detail, at a high level, what we've said is the risk is low that this thing gets cut down. And the risk, at least for now, is that it burns down is also low, right? And so that's an enabling policy alongside other market pieces that have actually meant when investors look at the UK natural capital market, they can tolerate much lower returns. Yeah, same is true of things that are cross-cutting across industries, like rule of law, land tenure, and security. One of the biggest challenges, I think, in the Amazon, which I've spent some time working on, is general security and general crime, which includes drugs, terrorism, people trafficking, nothing to do with nature, but all of those industries, all those, I'm going to say industry, they are industry, finance nature destruction along the way, and have an interest in keeping law enforcement out of those regions. And so, in some ways, you can do things like that to make the operating environment for everyone, from NGOs to private sector organizations, better and safer. But there will always be some things that remain out of scope.
One question on the back, and then we have one more.
Okay. Hi, thank you so much for your talk and for organizing, Alena. It's been really interesting. So I'm Julie Dmitrovich. I'm on the Business and Nature team at Fauna and Flora. And I just wanted to go back to one of your earlier points talking about real, like the asset managers who actually control financial flows, being pension funds and things like that, and how a lot of the market solutions are too small for those kind of investments to be made, and they have, regulatory obligations to their pensioners to make sure that they can retire. So you're dealing with like very tangible people problems, and similar to the healthcare industry, where we often don't want to touch that kind of subject because people really have a vested interest in that.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if there's more that we can do to work with that sector to get them to recognize that in 10, 20, 50 years, there's a real financial and physical risk of natural capital depletion of all these flows going into markets that are at tipping points that we know about, but aren't really on the big scale. And so I'm just starting to have these conversations, but really trying to figure out what is the influence to get fiduciary obligations to think about long-term risk. And is that something that you talk about? Or
Yeah, I mean, it's a super important theme. I think it's one that, our foundation has done work on this. There are lots of groups like the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change that has made the case for long-term climate investing. Same for nature. There's Nature Action 100. There are initiatives that are doing exactly this.
okay.
And I'd say they've had some success. I think they've had some success in at least winning the intellectual argument that this is important. But you still have to deal with real human beings who have limited information, limited time. You also deal with constraints. And I think the thing to remember about pension funds is you have both long-term obligations and short-term obligations.
Yeah.
You have, when you take money in, you have a 50-year obligation. You also have this year's obligation to pay people out. So what your return over the next 3 years is super important. Your ability to pay next year's retirees in the year after. So I think they have longer investment horizons than many investors, but there's always a short-term component. So they have to balance that legally and morally. And so I think making it as easy as possible to allocate capital in a way that doesn't put those two things in tension is really important, at least within this system.
Our online question.
Before I ask the online question, I'm just going to say that next door there is an early career researcher coffee and nice biscuits. So please go and spend time there, and Sid will be there, and you can hopefully ask him some more questions.
Everyone is welcome for team.
Anyway, yeah. So this final question is from James Crockett. What role does the insurance sector have in incentivizing investment in nature for the ecosystem services relating to resilience and de-risking infrastructure and our entire economy in the face of a changing climate? Big question.
Big question. I think huge role, huge role. Biggest role they play is by refusing to insure things. And it's already happening. I mean, so many things are uninsurable today that were perfectly insurable 10 or 15 years ago. Those include, houses in places that are include businesses and business operations. So they have a huge role. Insurers, frankly, what they can't do is make their policyholders do a specific thing. What they can do is say, I'll let you do whatever you want, but it's going to cost you. You can insure your hand if you're not this. And that can insure it, right? For extremely high premium, you can do anything, but the role they really play is making sure that the risks of nature and climate destruction and breakdown are not simply socialized. But they are to some extent private. And given insurance is such an important part of the economy, more premiums reflect the reality of some of the science is showing us, the better it will be. And there are some cases where you can insure new things, and that's where I say they can help. Where you can insure new solutions that may be too risky for, back to your point, investors. Insurance can help make it acceptable. In this case, in the UK, the government effectively acts as insurance. They say, "No, we will step in," but insurers can do that. So that's the one.
We're right on time, so I will just say a big thank you to Sid for being here. Thank you all for joining us, and join us also for the tea and coffee for some more chats. And we have next seminar plan. Okay, so it will be on the 29th of January with Professor Paul Lane from Department of Archaeology at the University of Cambridge about integrating deep history into conservation efforts on the African continent. Thank you so much, Diane. Thank you.